Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you to you, Graham, and to Bevan, and it's really a delight to be here on my first visit to Nottingham. It's a real honor and a pleasure to talk with you tonight, and I look forward to hearing Graham's work as well as a longtime admirer of his scholarship. The polar regions are in the headlines of late. Arctic ice is melting at potentially catastrophic rates as a result of global climate change, while circumpolar oil and gas reserves are currently targeted for mining in response to human fossil fuel overconsumption. At the same time, Antarctic missions under the banner of science are drilling into 15-million-year-old subglacial lakes looking for evidence of life, among other resource-focused investigations on the continent, and global warming has, of course, reached the Antarctic ice shelf as well. The news reported from the ends of the Earth has consequences not just for the North and South polar regions themselves, but for the planet. However remote and inhospitable Antarctica and the Arctic remain, despite technological innovations, these effects register across space and time. While the present attention to polar resources reflects the urgency of climate change and the demands on gas and mineral resources, these are not new concerns. Questions of resource identification and management, Arctic and Antarctic preservation and exploitation, and climatic variation have ever been the lead for stories about the polar regions. So how then did the first voyagers beyond 66 degrees north or south latitude understand the scale of their own news as it circulated beyond the geophysical space of the poles? I'm working on a book right now, or looking to complete a book now, that takes that question quite literally, exploring the difference in resources, both material and intellectual, presented by polar spaces. And by resources here, I'm referring both to the ecological substance of the polar regions in their remove from predictable routes and terms of exchange, and to the imaginative and literary outcomes of polar exploration, which themselves did not follow recognizable circuits. My more specific interest is in the forms of news and knowledge that circulate as intellectual and imaginative resources in geophysical and climatic extremity. I thought about calling this book Extreme Printing, but that it didn't seem, very little laughter. It didn't seem to really register with the people. This book is attuned to the tension between the global ambitions of polar voyages and the remarkably circumscribed conditions of their practice. The textual resources taken up by the news at the ends of the earth, as I'm calling the book now, emerged primarily from a little-known quirk in the histories of exploration and of books. There were printing presses aboard most polar voyages, most Anglo-American polar voyages, in the long 19th century, primarily after 1850. This is, again, a fact little registered, little known, little recognized. With these presses, expedition members produced newspapers for their own circulation only, circulation among icebound members of these polar expeditions. They also produced broadsides, plays, and other reading matter far beyond the Arctic and Antarctic circles. The sphere of literary circulation of these playful materials, and again, these are largely comic in content. They do not reflect the content and do not reproduce the content of the official voyage narratives that are later published. They are, in many ways, the social media of these polar expeditions. The literary circulation, the sphere of the literary circulation of these materials, which are intended for the private use, and this is repeatedly said, the private use of the expedition's men, was limited to the confines of their iced-in ships, where they were written and shared in sub-zero temperatures and in the unbroken darkness of the multiple months of polar winters. Although exceptionally constrained in practice, this print sphere is oceanic in implication. The field of exploration in my book in progress is therefore constituted in part by the rich but largely unremarked upon body of publications bearing polar imprints, rather than the histories and official journals of adventurous voyage and their fictional counterparts. This is the polar regions often show up in 19th century and 20th century fictions, which have been to date the most visible forms of literature generated by Arctic and Antarctic exploration. I'm interested as well in this project in other archives and forms of thought that organize themselves around the poles, whether open polar sea and hollow earth theories, Inuit epistemology and indigenous lifeways, ice balloons, polar and oceanic dead letters, which I'll be talking about today. I'm interested, in other words, in literary and textual production and circulation in oceanic terms. By this I mean that rather than viewing exchange as something that takes place transnationally, this blue shape may not be familiar to you in its contours alone. The lighter shapes on the contours of the blue shape are the boundaries that might register to you more primarily. We are used to thinking of the Atlantic Ocean in terms of North and South America and Europe and Africa, which are usually the dark parts of the map, not the ocean itself, which, while often blue, the color we associate with water, does not take primary form. The shape of the Atlantic Ocean is not a shape that is generally recognized as a shape in and of itself to map orientations that we are generally presented with in a geographical imaginary. Much like the view of the Earth that we are granted from satellites tends to stress the continents, such as this common view here of North America, or views that are oriented towards Europe. You see a glimpse of South America here, rather than a view of the Earth that takes the 71% primacy of the waters that cover the Earth as prime. This is a view of the Earth that is almost never presented in satellite views of the Earth. This is a view of the Pacific Ocean. This is not a doctored view. This is what the Pacific Ocean looks like. But this is not a view of the Earth that is generally presented to the public. Again, this is a kind of cartoonish way of pointing out a kind of oceanic reorientation, but I just wanted to show you a few images that do this. We're used to this particular map projection as well, one that is usually designed to show the continents without the grotesque distortions that Mercator projections provide to continental differences, ones that show Greenland is roughly the same size as Africa, even though it's less than 1/9 its size. This is a way of taking that oceanic view, or taking that continental view, and privileging the oceans rather than the continents. Or a view that, in this case, in the case of this mid-19th century map, takes a polar orientation, in this case a north polar orientation. So in this case, again, an oceanic reorientation can not only provide a perspectival difference that I have, again, rather roughly and crudely sketched here. An oceanic perspective can view exchange as something that takes place, rather than viewing exchange only as something that takes place transnationally, that is, between geographically abstracted states alone. This emerging field of oceanic studies is invested in recognizing the artificiality and intellectual limitations of certain kinds of boundaries, whether national, political, linguistic, physiological, or temporal, in studying forms of literary and cultural influence and circulation, especially on a globe that has a history that extends far longer than the time of nations or of continents. A fundamental premise of oceanic studies is that the familiar patterns of nation and capital-based relationality dissolve in the space and time of the sea. Still, even as the polar regions are oceanic spaces that frustrate imperial or national ambitions, they are yet governed by different geophysical forces and biological habits than the fluid, unfrozen nautical world more generally. Polar exchange in the form of newspapers, in the newspapers that were printed using the presses brought upon these ice-going, and ultimately ice-bound polar expedition ships, and bringing a press aboard a ship was a very unusual thing for general ships in this era in maritime world. I can talk more generally about that. So polar exchange in the form of newspapers, generating shipboard newspapers, is on one hand the most quotidian in the world. The distance between the illustrated London news and the illustrated Arctic news is not that great. This is a newspaper produced aboard one of the ships looking for the lost British explorer Sir John Franklin, and I'll say more about this in a second. On the other hand, it can be seen as the most eccentric in the sense that the blankness and barrenness of the polar regions both exceed the kind of traffic we think of as part of global or intranational exchange and also stand at its limit. And I'm just going to show you, since I'm not going to talk in any detail about the newspapers themselves, but because Graham Thompson's going to be talking about magazine circulation and periodical circulation in his talk, I'm going to just run through a few images of examples of polar newspapers that I've gathered in the last few years in my research. These are scattered and not the easiest things to find necessarily, in the sense that they often show up in the miscellaneous folders of an officer on a particular expedition. When these materials were cataloged, they were not deemed to be the most important part of the record of a given expedition. The Admiralty did not keep these records as part of its own records. Because they're ephemeral, and by definition ephemera within the collections in the various archives into which they are scattered, the cataloging itself was either imperfect or less detailed. This is not universally the case. The largest collection is in the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, or in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, or in Dartmouth College's Stephenson collection in New Hampshire in the US. But there are also scattered examples, and also in Canada's National Library. But there are also scattered examples found in random special collections really throughout the world. So this has been a big searching process. And so I'm going to run through a bunch of examples very quickly, but I could return to any at any point. And I'll also have more to say in a minute about why there are printing presses on ships shortly. So here's a facsimile of the Illustrated Arctic News. Neither I nor the one or two other people who have been interested in this have ever located the original, which might be in the collection of the royal family as possible. It's been suggested to me. That is a research archive I have not yet cracked. Here's an example from the Illustrated Arctic News that gives you an example, a sense of what the content was like. This is Benjamin Balloon getting high on hydrogen. Let me get this out of the way so you can see it a bit better. And take a note of the fact that the balloon, the image is quite dark. I apologize for the quality. These were all just archive shots that I've taken for my own research purposes, so they're not camera-ready copies. So I apologize for the darkness. You'll notice that Benjamin Balloon here has some bundles that are tied to his string. So take a note of that, and I'll explain what that is in a few minutes. Here is a slightly rougher-looking newspaper called the Polar Almanac from the ship Enterprise. I enjoy this one because it was printed by a captain named Henry Hester, which is a small victory and not a terribly interesting one, but it makes me happy. I like this newspaper titled The Weekly Guy. Here's a little joke slip from the postmaster, which of course is not a role that would need to exist in the Barrow Amateur Printing Office in the far north. There is no postal exchange. There's no need for letter sorters or carriers. This is pure comedy here, this kind of advertisement. So here's the kind of ways that the printing press was used for comedy, for the distribution of the post office's distribution of newspapers and other materials. Here's the Queen's Illuminated magazine, printed on yellow paper by one of the most active of the Arctic printers, a man named H. Bryant from Edward Belcher's expedition, who did a tremendous amount of printing. The largest volume of polar printing that remains comes from the press of a common seaman named Mr. Bryant. Here's another example as well. The noble art of printing being established in Trap Lane, easily accessible to all parts of the city. That is their ship in the Arctic. Again, I'm going to move quickly through these because I have other things to show you. Not all newspapers that were printed, even on ships that had a press. Sometimes there were manuscript newspapers. This is the Port Folk Weekly News with its very dramatic iconography. that was printed, or rather published upon a ship that had a press, but did not use it for the publication of the newspaper. This is on the United States, Isaac Israel Hayes' Arctic Expedition of 1861. Here's a glimpse of what the Port Book Weekly News looks like. So this exists only in one copy because it's a manuscript newspaper. This is the New York Public Library. The Flight of the Plover, or the North Polar Charivari, also a manuscript newspaper. The Discovery News from the Nares expedition was a printed paper. This is printed actually very well. The Arctic Moon, not printed as well. This is from the Lady Franklin Bay expedition this is not, Greeley was a strong supporter of polar expeditions. These are in rather poor condition. This is probably the roughest of the later amateur presses. The Arctic Eagle, this particular sheet was printed by the gentleman who I showed you in that early image of the man who was printing while surrounded by his shipmates in their sleeping bags, all bundled up. This is one of the products of that press. The most elaborate of the newspapers that was published in Antarctica by Robert Falcon Scott's first expedition, not his fatal one. He published a newspaper called the South Polar Times, which was also printed on the fatal expedition as well, although it was not reprinted until much later. Volume 4 came out on the fatal expedition. The South Polar Times was actually a typescript newspaper and was very elaborately illustrated because at this point in the history of polar printing, it was not just something that one did to pass the time, but it became a given that one would produce a newspaper and do it in style. And the editor of this newspaper, the South Polar Times, was Lieutenant Ernest Shackleton, who was one of Scott's officers. The first book printed in Antarctica was printed by Ernest Shackleton on his first command on the Nimrod, which was, again, not Shackleton's own famous voyage on the Endurance. This was his first own command, printed at the Sign of the Penguins, a book called Aurora Australis. It's thought that he printed about 90 copies. About 60 of those are presently accounted for. Each one of them varies because the binding materials varied based on the materials they had on hand. So some of the versions I have seen include the Stewed Kidneys edition. I've also seen one of the fruit editions, in addition to seeing some orange crate editions as well. They're spectacularly beautiful. These are really beautiful editions. And they're beautiful because before going on his Antarctic South Polar expedition, Ernest Shackleton took his crew for 2 weeks to a London printer and had them train in printing because they were going to print a book as well as try to reach the South Pole. So part of my book is interested in how within about 50 years the point of polar expedition was not just science and reaching the poles, but let's produce the prettiest book we could possibly print. They also printed, as I mentioned, playbills for their shipboard theatricals. These, again, are circulating sometimes in crews that were as small as 14 men, but yet they were printing enough copies that they exist in multiple copies in archives today. They would label their printing offices. In this case, the Pantomime of Zero that's being advertised here was written aboard the ship by the men. So they're performing both the popular farces of the day, as well as historic plays, as well as material that they wrote themselves. They liked the Pantomime of Zero so much they performed it all the time. It shows up on a lot of these playbills. They performed Hamlet. Here's another, The Scapegrace, in various editions. They also had Thursday Pops. You'll notice that in this case, too, in the Nares expedition, in their Thursday Pops, where they had songs, they would give lectures, and they also had blackface minstrelsy shows. So no place is too far to go for a racist performance. They would write their own songs. This is a Song of the North dedicated to the wife of the captain, also printed in the Arctic regions. Here's a version of the English maiden song from the very popular Pantomime of Zero, printed on pink silk, hand-hemmed at the National Maritime Museum. Here's one, just to give you a close-up of the imprint of Melville Island Press. I wanted to show you, in case you're not familiar with your northern Canadian islands, Melville Island, I don't think I have a pointer here, is, if you see Victoria Island, if you look due north of Victoria Island, you see where Melville Island is. So this is pretty far north and west in this case. And so they're advertising not just the place, the specific location of where their printing offices are, Track Lane, but also the locations of the particular islands. And to just, for perspective, I also wanted to point out to you, this also is a map that is really far north. If you can notice, the Yellowknife is one of the southernmost cities on this map. So the northernmost provinces of Canada, you're seeing their northernmost parts here. This is a map that's rather far north. And I also want to point out to you that the recent, you possibly have read the news of the discovery recently of one of the missing ships of Sir John Franklin's, the Erebus, that was recently located. This is the British explorer who went missing in 1845, and then basically annually since 1845, there have been expeditions looking for him and his men and his ships. They've recovered one of the ships this past summer. Well, they haven't recovered it yet. They've located it. The Canada has. And that was located here in King William Island, just off King William Island. So just for a perspective's sake, and Franklin will be important in a minute. So, but for the remainder of my time today, I'm going to talk about a different aspect of oceanic textual circulation that was made using the same presses that produced these newspapers. Excuse me. So I'm going to talk about a different aspect of textual circulation, and that's the Arctic dead letter, the cairn message, the cached note, the letter in a bottle, the scroll in a copper cylinder. I'm going to say a few words about what the post looked like in general in this period, and then I want to walk through some examples of C-19 Arctic messages, whether delivered or not. This is a chapter that I'm presently writing, and so it's material that at the point at which I start showing you these examples, I will just be speaking to you about them and trying to think through various aspects of circulation in terms that exceed the function of newspapers in terms of solidifying community and creating national, in Benedict Anderson's famous and now well-established and well-critiqued understanding of the function of newspapers in nation building, and thinking about the kind of community function and also the time-marking function that newspapers do. The present chapter that I'm writing on the Arctic dead letter is trying to think about what function print is serving in circulation in terms of the circuits of mail delivery and reception. So after a person writes a letter, in the 19th century as much as today, although writing a letter is becoming more of a lost art, she encloses it in an envelope, places postage upon it, and submits it to the handling of the postal service, and trusts that even though multiply handled through various vehicles of transport, it will arrive intact, sealed, and ready for the private reception of its intended audience. A statement that is true for digital communication as well, right? Both in terms of its privacy, its delivery, its transmission. These questions are also true of digital communication. This process is exceptionally intimate in its presumption of the one-to-one correspondence and shared tactile experience of its sender and its recipient. At the same time, it is a broadly public form of exchange, predicated upon the hand-to-hand transmission of the agents of delivery, the national postal systems that underwrite it, and the economies of the world of letters on the register of both the local, the stationers and the news agents who provide the materials and tools, as well as the global. In the 19th century, for example, in the 18th century, the Syrian Gall ink that provides the means for the message itself, or gum from the Sudan. The intersection between the private and public spheres of letters has been well described by scholars of epistolary exchange in its fictional and non-fictional forms. And likewise, the letter's function as an itinerant signifier has been the subject of influential meditations by Jacques Lacan and Jacques Derrida, by Lacan and Derrida. And although those two theorists might disagree about whether a letter always arrives at its destination or whether it may always not arrive at its destination, they concur about the general economy of epistolary exchange as a system of personal and impersonal object relations. Both the historicist scholars and theorists have in turn taken up the evocative functions of the dead letter office, especially in the context of Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, most familiarly. The narrator's shock at finding out that Bartleby had worked with dead letters has been seen to represent the alienation of labor and the failure of communication as one of the more common readings of this. Indeed, for Derrida and the postcard, death, which demarcates the space between correspondence, is the inevitable destiny of all letters. But letters exchanged at sea do not follow these trajectories of correspondence. I refer here not to the 19th century transatlantic mail system, by which one could send a letter from the US to France, for example, paying postage as one did in the 19th century, both in the country of origin and destination, although I've discovered that one does that as well today in France, as well as a separate sea postage to the carrier. This is why a lot of sailors would try to illegally make a little extra money by illegally carrying mail in their ditty bag, because people would try to avoid all of this triple rate on letters. But instead, I'm interested in the letters whose places of emission and destination were aboard ships, again, not being sent via ships, but whose destination or place of emission were on ships themselves, to and from sailors, as well as the cairn messages left on coasts or on other terrestrial spots or on icebound realms for other seamen to find. Their circuits of delivery and receipt share with the formal post a process of heterogeneous handling, but one stripped of all regularizing process, pattern, and form. Message exchange and mail delivery at sea is a way to think about marking time and linear connection in a nautical environment that can be seen as outside of, beyond, or hostile to time and linearity, much like, again, newspapers might be seen this way. But messages and letters were thrown to the commerce of the sea, indifferently handled, passed along, left behind, intercepted. Correspondence nevertheless often reached its address. The provisional postal exchanges that took place at sea, in ports, at cairns, in watering spots, in floating bottles, were surprisingly effective ways of delivering mail, or so it would seem. In their voyage journals and narratives, sailors describe their postal successes, but less frequently, if ever, mention the letters that are lost, adrift, or dead. My attention in this chapter that I'm working through now is to mail and other periodic circuits of delivery or connection in places that would seem to persistently frustrate institutional or industrial networks, and yet create oceanic forms of connection in another medium. And oceanic connections that I don't mean in necessarily an aspirational or particularly optimistic way, in oceanic in their sense of dispersion and fragmentation, of erasure and annihilation. And the way this happened is that Anglo-American polar expeditions in the 19th century were required to leave messages in cairns and other outposts at regular intervals, sometimes daily, in multiple copies, often on pre-printed forms in 6 languages. And these are part of admiralty and naval orders. So the thing I'm currently obsessed with, and this is, again, the in-progress aspect of the work, and the reading part will break off very shortly, is about the status, and here's the kind of broader book history question in this part of this, is the status of the form, the pre-printed form in the history of the book. The form is neither a printed book nor part of manuscript culture, right? It's dismissed in the history of printing as job printing. The kind of printing that Benjamin Franklin did, for example, the majority of the printing that the famous printer Benjamin Franklin did was job printing, printing up forms, printing up receipts, printing up blank books for people, printing up things that were commissioned by merchants, by lawyers, by people about town, that do not constitute what we would think of as literary printing or political printing. It was job printing. which nonetheless accounted for the great majority of most printers' work in the 18th and 19th centuries. 70 to 90% of most printers' work was job printing. So the topic of job printing is, excuse me, is something that has not really been dealt with in any substantive way by people who work in print cultural studies or the history of the book, because it neither represents a book nor represents culture in the way that these fields have constituted themselves. And those fields think largely of people like authors and booksellers and publishers, readers. And in blank forms, we don't think of blank forms as having authors or readers, right? We think of them as being printed and used, but not authored and read. But yet, as Jim Green and Peter Stallybrass have pointed out in their work on Benjamin Franklin, job printing has blank spaces for completion by manuscript hand. And so the argument that they are making is that manuscript, that we like to think of as that when printing revolution happens, that manuscript hand becomes less frequently used in the history of circulation of texts. But what Jim Green and Peter Stallybrass argue is that nowhere was printing more revolutionary than in its incitement to writing by hand. That what job printing then produces is, and this is getting Green and Stallybrass's language, was a radical proliferation not only of writing undertaken for the press, but also of printing to be completed by hand, tax forms, passports, diaries, etc. That you may not only read a blank form, but if the form is to fulfill its function, it must be filled in. And so Lisa Gittleman, and so here's a couple examples of some pre-printed Colorforms. These are ones that are not printed in the Arctic regions, but were pre-printed for use aboard ship. One of these was a form for some musical entertainment aboard ship, which could be determined later. Another was for various services afloat, and what kinds of objects or men might become unserviceable. This was a blank letter form for the Arctic expeditions, and this form was designed to be used for writing the daily messages that would then be either left in a cairn or thrown overboard in a bottle. So hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these forms would be left with captains or with officers who'd be leaving the record. So here's a blank version of this, and here are a couple examples of what they would look like after they'd be filled out. So this one is also from the Nares expedition, which did a lot of printing as well. So this is a copy of a notice left in a cairn at, I think that's Flocking Beach. So in this particular example, this ship would leave its latitude, its longitude, wherever they are, Floberg Beach it is, sorry, Floberg Beach. Would say where they were going, what they had just done, here's where we are, they leave this message in a cairn. Here's another message. This is a letter. My dear Stevenson. So these are the kinds of ways that people would use pre-printed forms aboard ship. And so Lisa Gittleman has a wonderful book that came out earlier this year called Paper Knowledge, Towards a Media History of Documents, which is thinking about the forms of documents that, like blank forms, like PDFs, like the kind of lowly forms, like tax forms, death certificates, within the history of print. It's a wonderful book. That some books are not for reading, she argues, but for writing. Thinking about the books that are not for reading, but for writing. Blank books, journals, notebooks, etc. But forms are printed in the Arctic regions as well, and most of them emerge from a particular contingency. I've mentioned Sir John Franklin a couple of times, and I asked you to look when Benjamin Balloon got high on hydrogen. What was dangling from his balloon thread in those bundles were packets of messages. As part of the Franklin search expeditions, Franklin's ship sails in 1845. In 1847 and 1848, when nobody's heard from Franklin, he hasn't been sending back messages. It's not just that Franklin hasn't returned home in 1847 or 1848, but no ships have found cairns. No ships have received passing messages. There have been no communications from Franklin ships by 47, 48, so people start to get worried. And so in the next 15 years, 40 missions plus go searching for Franklin to try to find survivors, to try to find the ships, to try to find the men. And then basically annually since, there have been recovery missions. Up until, again, there have been submarine ships recently, and they found the ship this past summer, which I never actually thought would quite happen, which is silly of me. They found it. So starting in 1850, on one of the Franklin search expeditions, a printing press was brought on board in order to print on colored silk messages that would be attached to hydrogen balloons, to fire balloons, whose cords would be lit, and then the silk-colored balloon messages would be widely dispersed over the ice, with their latitude and longitude notation printed on the silk, the colored silk, by the press aboard ship, by the 1,000. So the press was then designed to increase the possibility of that printing load. And the sailors aboard the ship said, we have a press aboard, let's make a newspaper. And from that point, there were presses aboard ship both to assist in the conduct of the Franklin search expeditions, to assist in printing up fun things like menus for special occasions, playbills for the theatricals, other forms of innovation for entertainment and literary and creative production on ship, but also to assist in the Franklin search expeditions. Not exclusively, but that was the primary reason to have presses on ship. Here's an underwater sonar image of the ship Erebus, Franklin's lead ship, on the seafloor provided by Parks Canada, located in the exact place the Inuit said it was beginning in 1851, which all of the collected white nations of the world rejected as evidentiary useful information. So this is one of the packets of Franklin's 8-foot circumference of balloons. This is a copy of one of those silk-printed balloon messages. Notice the copy, they do not waste the colored silk on the copy. These are balloon messages on colored oiled paper. This is not on silk, this is on oiled colored paper. This I just saw on Thursday and Friday. I managed to get a couple of days in the National Archives in Kew. So this is one of the things that was in the Admiralty records there. Here's another copy. This is from Canada's Library and Archives Canada. Another copy from the search messages. It's the vanishingly few. I think only 4 or 5 scraps of balloon messages were ever recovered from the ice. Of those thousands, most disappeared. This is one of the very few that were ever recovered. This is at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. And as you can see, the actual latitude and longitude information didn't survive the actual printing process so much. But the message did. Perhaps this was a blank, but this is one of the few scraps that did survive. There are 2 cairn records that survived from the Franklin expedition that were found much later. This is the famous one that confirmed the death of Sir John Franklin himself, which predated the mass vanishing of the 129 men and the ships in general. This message was found in a cache in a cylinder, where there's a certain point in the middle of the message where you see Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition, all well, and then 9 months later, around the side, it says Sir John Franklin died on such and such a date. A couple other men died of unspecified causes. They're moving on. There's no cause given for Franklin's death. At some point after that, the vast majority of the other 100+ men died. Their ships disappeared. Again, these are ongoing mysteries. But this is the one famous scrap of evidence found by Francis Leopold McClintock in 1859. So this is 14 years after Franklin had disappeared. Even though the Inuit had said, again, many years ago, like, let us tell you where to look. Like that was, Dickens were like, the Inuit have cannibalized them. It was all very big, ongoing problem. So copper cylinders, tin cylinders, were one way that messages were formed. I'm going to just show you a few more images, and then I'm going to wrap up here, of these kinds of messages. This is a copper cylinder left by an American explorer named Charles Francis Hall, my favorite of the crackpot polar explorers. Francis Hall had no nautical experience. He was a Cincinnati newspaperman, would camp in his backyard to get used to the chill, and hitched a ride on a whaling ship, went totally solo, and then lived with the Inuit for a total of 7 years, totally on his own. He was the only person who ever adapted to Inuit lifeways. He was the only person to ever refer to the Inuit as the Inuit, not the Eskimo, in like the history of 19th century polar exploration, and then was murdered by white sailors the first time he had a command of European sailor ships. He was poisoned to death. I'm not sure why I'm laughing about that. He's kind of amazing. But this is I came across this. I was in the Smithsonian doing research, and I opened a box, and there's a copper cylinder there with the record still inside it, which was very poor archival management by the Smithsonian. So before I alerted them to the fact that there was still a record inside it, I enjoyed viewing it, at which point they took it away from me. But you can see that even for the U.S., much like flashback, you see in 6 languages that whoever finds this paper is requested to forward to the Secretary of the Admiralty with a note of the time and place at which it was found or delivered to the British consul in the nearest port. So these are the pre-printed forms as well that were distributed by the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds by expeditions. So the U.S. Navy had the same form, forwarded to the Secretary of the Navy in Washington, D.C., or to the nearest U.S. consul. These pre-printed forms are distributed by the thousands. Only a handful of them recirculate. But there's no mention in these correspondence of, can you think of all the papers that we've lost? But just like, guess what? We found another message. Here's from the Admiralty, just again, these last couple of days, another paper that was discovered in a tin cylinder from the Erebus. This is the only other scrap of fragment other than the news of Franklin's death ever recovered from the Franklin expedition. This is from an earlier part. This is from 1845 when the expedition first launches. Everything's going well. Oh, well. They switched at some point away from tin and copper because it was discoloring the paper too much. Here's another printed aboard ship, a record deposited in a cache. Here's where we are. Here's what we're doing. So this is the point at which the printing presses start improvising. They're not using pre-printed forms anymore. They start using coming up with other options. And so these are some sketches. Everything I'm showing you from now on is stuff that I just saw on Thursday or Friday. So I'm just giving you the shit that I found, and we can talk about it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. This is the cool stuff I found. Here's what a cairn might look like. Let's build it high, put the Union Jack up. I don't know how many Union Jacks they had with them, if they're painting them on boards. I'm pretty sure they're painting them on boards at this point for visibility and for lasting. So here's how one erects a cairn. Or you can make a flag. That pulls out of bamboo. And then you see that you have the cylinder, right? They also there's a point at which they decided to start to build a cairn and then bury the record due north 10 feet so that the Inuit would not steal the records, as if there was like a big trade in stealing the records. They're very, very nervous about the Inuit, who all they wanted to do was help. There's like no record of the Inuit ever once sabotaging or interfering with or attacking or doing anything. Yeah. So here, our familiar printer H. Bryant once again gives a notice of maneuvers and movements. This is a message that again is left in a record. Here's a different version of a form also done by H. Bryant, a little less narrative. This one is a narrative form. We had a Marine who died of the abscess of the lungs. This one is more of a form that gives possible places as an incitement to filling in by manuscript hand, right? But what I loved about this too is there's a thumbprint. There's a fingerprint here. This, again, it could be by someone from the Admiralty pasting this record into the books, into the Admiralty's sloppily bound books from mid-century. If this were H. Bryant's fingerprint, which I'm going to choose to imagine, it was a wonderful archival encounter. Here's some more papers deposited in cairns, in various depots. They would also leave supplies, and so these papers would be deposited in supply depots. Here's a copy of a message thrown overboard. So they're also throwing things in bottles as well. In this case, this is a message left at a Russian trading depot that was asked to be distributed by the natives, by the Yupik in this case. On the whole, not unfriendly, but have to be dealt with cautiously. All right. So here's another one. This paper is printed for distribution by the natives of Point Barrow among the Eastern Eskimo. So there's a point at which they decide we can print materials to distribute among the natives, not for them to read, but to distribute in turn to other white men that they might encounter. So all of these strategies for distribution of materials are happening. You've got carrier messages, you've got caches, you've got ships and bottles, you have printed materials that are handed to the Inuit and the Yupik and other native peoples for recirculation and distribution. Carrier pigeons was another option. Here's a carrier pigeon that was shot down on the coast of Ireland, and because it was stamped, someone who in Ireland had read about the use of carrier pigeons for the location of Sir John Franklin, cut off the wing, sent it to the Admiralty, and said, "Is this your pigeon?" The cairns that were created in the Arctic, just like the huts that were created in Antarctica, still stay where they are. So today, a popular tourist spot, relatively popular, for the Northern Canadian Arctic, is the Beechey Island gravesite of 3 men of the Franklin expedition who died very early in the expedition. And the shot that I opened with is the grave of these 3 men. This is a 19th century sketch of the graves of Torrington, Hartnell, and Brain. These graves still, again, remain as they are. And again, there are many ventures that visit that spot. And so in closing, in wrapping up, in thinking about how these polar blanks circulate and how this incitement to manuscript circulates, I'm trying to think through not just the way that the forms of circulation that we associate with things like newspapers and with things like printed playbills as ephemera that nonetheless marks our daily interaction with community, but in thinking about the impossibility and the humor. I mean, we're all laughing. I'm laughing. I'm making jokes about this, of throwing these things out into regions whose very ecological substance is designed to destroy print. And thinking about the possibilities both for recovery and for thinking about in oceanic terms what that kind of circulation can mean versus the very few places where the possibility of retaining places in a moment again, in our present Anthropocene moment, where such spaces are rapidly changing, disappearing, being radically transformed, and thinking about the kind of blanks that are produced in polar printing that provide incitements for filling with a kind of imagination that can be, on the one hand, the most optimistic in the world, and on the other hand, can leave us with very little of a vision for what it will look like, what forms of media will be available to us in the Anthropocene, in an era of irreversible climate change. Thank you very much.